misuse of resources. So again, the whole question of this mega infrastructure needs to be interrogated to see whether this is the best use of money. Just to summarize, I think I'll just end with the point where I started. When we talk means of implementation, we need to stop thinking about money coming from one part of the world coming to another part of the world. What we need to ask ourselves, why is in this why are the poorer countries able to generate the resources that they require for their own implementation, and to begin to unlock these obstacles that are preventing their true transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ali. And thank you for kicking off that discussion by providing a wider lens on looking at resource mobilization and means of implementation, looking at systemic issues and related concerns, particularly obstacles to resource mobilization that face developing countries. Thank you for that. Now we go to Noreen Kennedy. Yeah, that was my fault because I was looking this way. It should be Pedro's turn. Yes. Pedro? Yes.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Well, I'm basically going to be speaking about Brazil's take on this, the positions that we defend with regard to mobilization of resources. I guess I'll be echoing some of the previous speakers' references with regard to, systemic reform and so on. We see, also echoing the question, where should the money come from? We think that for such a complex agenda, we need a complex set of responses. The money obviously has to come from many different sources, starting with domestic sources. Clearly, the country's acceptance of their primary responsibility for their own development is more valid today than ever before. But this also, we see that it requires a commensurate policy space for governments to adopt and implement appropriate regulatory frameworks. This includes, for example, an enabling environment for national development banks to play an important role towards financing for development. With regard to domestic resources, this question of tax, increasing tax revenue base and combating tax evasion and illicit financial flows, we also consider to be a very, very key component. If we looking at it overall, I mean, currently illicit financial flows account for 5 to 6 times what the total ODA flows amount to. Looking at private investments, clearly the implementation of the Agenda 2030 can't rely only on state action. It also requires structural transformations relating to all sectors of society. If you look at SDG 12, for example, on sustainable consumption and production, this is something that is particularly important for investment decisions by private actors. We in Brazil, the Brazilian government has from the very beginning of the whole negotiation process of the SDGs sought to engage with civil society, with the private sector, in debates that really helped us to refine our negotiating positions. And we feel that this has led to increased ownership of the agenda. How does the Brazilian government try to encourage private sector sustainable investments? Well, first by engaging with different associations that bring together private actors around the SDG agenda. And then I would say that key elements in this regard are the production and dissemination of knowledge, translating the SDGs into the local reality, highlighting the reflection of the SDGs in public policies, and also the development of compacts regarding issues such as standards of transparency, accountability, social and environmental responsibility, and tax compliance, for example. It's important to demonstrate to businesses that not only can they not remain indifferent to the whole process, but they stand to risk diminishing returns if they attempt to not be a part of this process. Another issue that I would highlight, which has been brought up in the UN inquiry on sustainable finance, is the question of financial regulations. In the case of Brazil, there are a couple of initiatives that can be mentioned. such as the Corporate Sustainability Index that was developed by the São Paulo Stock Exchange, and also measures that have been taken by the central bank to strengthen the management of socio-environmental risks, demanding that banks monitor such risks. Now a word about resources at the international level. Brazil has been a very active supporter of initiatives such as the Addis Ababa Action Agenda and the Technology Facilitation Mechanism. We see the Addis Ababa Action Agenda as placing the right to development at the center of the debate. We see the Technology Facilitation Mechanism as representing an innovative step in the right direction of scaling up the contribution of the UN to global cooperation and technology transfer and creating multi-stakeholder partnerships, but we do have some concerns with regard to some of these processes. With regard to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, for example, we have to be very careful so that it should not be interpreted as a prioritization of specific SDGs. We have to be very alert with regard to the importance of maintaining the integral approach to the SDGs. We don't want the integrated approach. We don't want to undermine that in any way. And the Addis Ababa agenda should not be seen as a parallel agenda that could compete with the SDGs. With regard to ODA, although we see that the reliance on ODA is something that's clearly not sustainable in the long run, it remains for the foreseeable future something that's very relevant for many developing countries. In this light, we are concerned with some attempts by developed countries to redefine their historic commitments to ODA flows, establishing artificial deadlines, alternative methods of measurements, and so on. Any debates on the application of Target 17.2 should include recipient countries. A word on South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation, with its focus on flexibility, emphasis on capacity building, horizontal and participatory approach, and lack of conditionalities, can lead to an increased focus on local ownership and can be an important tool also for contributing to sustainable development. Even if the actual numbers are much smaller in many cases than traditional North-South cooperation. So it's important that, that the UN system for South-South cooperation be strengthened to support this modality of cooperation. Lastly, a few words on trade, which we also see as extremely important. We had, to promoting sustainable development, we had important results here in Nairobi last year in December, in the last WTO round, ministerial round, and we remain committed to combating protectionism and trade distortions in agricultural trade and to defending the relevance of special treatment to developing countries, in particular LDCs. I think I'll wrap it up with that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for sticking to your time and for being so comprehensive in providing us an overview of what Brazil is doing in the area of means of implementation and mobilizing resources for sustainable investments. Thank you, too, for broadening the discussion beyond finance by referring to the technology facilitation mechanism recently established by the UN and also South-South cooperation, trade, and ODA. I'm sure that a lot of our participants can't wait to ask more questions about that. And lastly, thanks for addressing the initial questions that I asked through to the panel. And I think that's a good start, so we can focus more on the questions that will be raised by the audience during the exchange. So now it's Noreen's turn.
Thanks, Net. And I have some slides, if we could put those up. Not too many. I'll try to keep to time. And the slides are up. Could you also put them up so we could see them here on the monitors? That would help. Is that possible? If not, you did it before. Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, so let me start. I think the starting point for my presentation is a report that was prepared by the Global Opportunity Network, which is a Scandinavian group. It includes DNV, it includes Sustainia, it includes the Monday Morning Institute, And it's really about a quote that I always use in my presentations, which is the SDGs are now the job description for business. And I think that applies for everything that we are talking about, including means of implementation. And so what I'm going to discuss quickly is what the business community involved in this looks like, because we're a very big, diverse group, not just limited to finance and not just limited to big companies in developed countries, but pretty much across the board. Thank you. There's my quote. You can go to the next slide, please. How we see the very big picture of sustainability decisions and our role in implementation, and then some suggestions for UNEP's onward work. Next slide, please. So this is the very big ocean that my little organization swims in. This is a picture of logos of the groups that make up something called the Global Business Alliance for 2030. So that's a coalition of business groups working on the SDGs. It's the major group focal point in New York. It includes the Global Compact. It's probably one of the most representative business coalitions you're ever going to see, along with some multi-stakeholder partnerships associated with it. And this is just an indication of how, number one, broadly committed businesses and also all of the different potential solutions and investments and deployment of implementation that is resident in this group. Next slide, please. So here's a picture that shows how we look at the SDGs. Because the business community has a hard time with the big number like 17 SDGs, so we decided to look for 4 priorities, 4 lenses through which we view them, both in terms of what governments will be doing, but also in terms of what we have to do. And all 4 of these broad categories apply to all 17 SDGs. Like the Brazilian delegate who just spoke, we don't see a prioritization. So it's good governance, and that's both for public and private sectors. It's economic growth and empowerment. It's infrastructure, and not just built infrastructure, but also infrastructure for health or education. And then it's innovation, and it's innovation not just in terms of technology, but also in institutions, and at the center of that is sustainable development. Next slide, please. So now I'm a terrible PowerPoint slide maker, as this slide is Exhibit A to show, but I wanted to just give you a sense of how we were starting to see means of implementation, deployment of investments in connection with these 4 headline areas. And obviously, this is just a kind of tip of the iceberg for each of these lists, but to give you a sense of how we do see it. So with regard to good governance, as some of the previous speakers have said, bribery and corruption is a problem both in government and the private sector, strong enforcement in institutions, rule of law. All of that is really critical when we talk about deploying finance, investment, and so on. With regard to economic growth and empowerment, the right to title and property, strengthening the formal economy and bringing people out of the informal economy so more domestic resources are available, and then open trade and market access, including for greener goods and energy sources. For infrastructure, it's mobilizing domestic resources, it's public-private partnerships, and then innovation. There are so many innovative approaches out there, and some of them have come out through the UNEP inquiry into a sustainable financial system. But, alternatives to cash, sustainability bonds. I think Starbucks announced today that they were issuing their first sustainability bond, and new business opportunities in addressing sustainability challenges, such as what I mentioned earlier, the Global Opportunity Network. Next slide, please. So just to be very, very rapid, and I'm not going to read the slide to you because you can see it, in terms of addressing problems and gaps in the policy arena, that's quite critical, and some of the previous speakers have mentioned them, but we also have to demonstrate economic opportunities and incentives. And we're finding that that's the most persuasive argument, and that's where we're going to put a lot of our energy. But some of these other matters are also quite important. And again, I think we often fall into the silo, if I can call it that, of when we talk about means of implementation and finance, we invite banks to the table, but we actually have to bring a lot of other business entities of various shapes and sizes into the conversation. Next slide, and almost last slide, I think. Oh, just some of the work that we still have to do in business. I mean, there does seem to be this tendency where we do a lot of counting of dollars or euros spent and not enough about the impact of those dollars or euros. So we need to do a lot more on that front in terms of impact, transparency, and reporting. There are many codes and principles out there, but still a lot more to do. And clearly, reporting and disclosure is a key way in which we can involve the broader community in terms of both what money is deployed and what the money is achieving. One more slide, please. So takeaways for UNEP. This is almost my last slide before thank you. We definitely need to deploy, mobilize, catalyze, whatever verb you want to use, in finance and investment from public sector, from the private sector, and we have to work in partnership. Green inclusive growth goes hand in hand with economic empowerment, and there are some fundamental needs on economic empowerment at the national level. Perhaps for our consideration, maybe at a future UNEA we could aim to hold a joint or parallel meeting with the financing for development process. That could be very useful. And then we need to do more to advance institutional innovation to reflect and carry forward the agenda, including in global markets and commercial and economic institutions. And the best way to do that is to work with business and other stakeholders. We'll go to my last slide, which I think just says thank you and has some websites. Next slide, please. And last slide. And that's it. So looking forward to questions, and it's really good that a number of the things that previous speakers have said are very similar to what I said. I think great minds are thinking alike, and this is really at the heart of implementation of the 2030 Development Agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noreen. Despite your claim that it's a bad slide, I think I'm really impressed. For someone who cannot even make those nice things and shapes, it's really impressive. Thank you for providing us with a framework that business is operating, that is actually guided with, in engaging on mobilizing resources for sustainable investments. That covers governance, innovations, and also the economic growth, and the other one on infrastructure, which also the previous speakers have actually spoken to, particularly Pedro's discussions, overview on what Brazil's take on this topic. And thank you too for the recommendations. I think that idea of having a parallel FFD with UNEA would be good, taking off from the initial roundtable that is going to be held later this week, which is initially actually focused mainly on mobilizing private resources that could actually be broadened up to cover others, as well as the systemic issues that Ali has enumerated on earlier, and other aspects of means of implementation as a whole. So now we go to Ivo Mulder. Yes.
Thanks very much, Nath. Good morning, everyone. I think let me echo also what the other panelists mentioned, which is I think we need a diversified approach to financing the Sustainable Development Goals. That is beyond, say, international public funding to catalyze sustainable development, but also includes domestic resource mobilization and private sector investment. And I think that is something that I've heard from all panelists. So I think that is something that you hear, I think, at a lot of different fora. Let me zoom in on one particular area, which is on uptake and reduction of carbon emissions from forest and land use. I'm working on the UNREP program, which is an interagency program together with UNEP, UNDP, and FAO. We work in 60 partner countries to help them get ready for implementation and ultimately achieve a reduction or removal of carbon emissions. About $10 billion has been pledged to reduce emissions from forest and land use, of which 90% is from public sources. What is, however, important to realize is that, as mentioned by the panelists here, there's a growing awareness and feeling that a more diversified approach is necessary. It's great to see that 2015 was basically the year of positive development and of commitments, with the third Finance for Development meeting in Addis Ababa, the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, and also the the agreement, the climate agreement in Paris. 2016 and beyond needs to be the years of implementation. And indeed, how do we finance that? In addition to scale up international public funding by developed countries, OECD countries, including for forest and sustainable land use, there is a need to realign and increase domestic resource mobilization. What we see in some developing countries is that, for example, agricultural fiscal policies are 100 times larger than international REDD+ funding to conserve forest, which in that sense could actually be seen as an inefficient subsidy by themselves. So I think that there's a need for greater compatibility between, in this case, increasing output of the agricultural sector, stimulating sustainable economic development and employment with reduced emissions from forests. The other element that's been mentioned is the involvement of the private sector. Spearheaded by the Consumer Goods Forum, now more than 400 companies have pledged zero net deforestation, which is at the moment relatively disconnected from our work with governments. And I think there's a huge opportunity to see greater compatibility. This whole notion of removing deforestation from commodity supply chains to satisfy a growing group of consumers who want to consume with lower environmental footprints needs to be aligned with our efforts at, say, the international and national level to achieve emission reductions. So those are the 3 points that I'd like to mention. The last point that was briefly touched upon by Noreen as well is the use of, say, non-traditional sources of capital, including from institutional private investors. Last year, about $66 billion of green bonds have been issued, mostly in the area of energy and transport. And within UNEP, we're also interested and actively looking to expand that area in forest and land use. So this is something that we hope will materialize and will basically lead to enlargement of the capital pool available to stimulate the shift from, say, unsustainable to sustainable land use. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivo. I'm very impressed. Wow, 5 minutes. Thank you, and I think that really actually stimulated or incited some questions, particularly from those groups that are very critical of what Ivo has been discussing, REDD. In many cases, the mention of REDD actually signals or puts on a red button in many discussions, and I hope there will be some engagement on that, particularly on the question on how to align mobilization of resources towards the SDGs and how to make this investment sustainable, not just sustainable in terms of time, but sustainable in terms of really complying with what we know about sustainability in interventions. So the last speaker is Kwesi. From Tax Justice Africa. So your turn.
Thank you, Neth. I think coming after these brilliant presentations, I would borrow quite a bit from my colleagues. To start with, I think both Ali and I think Pedro preempted my short presentation. I mean, one thing I think I remember Ali pointed out was that we need to create the conditions in the countries to be able to create the money. In other words, you cannot expect money to come from anywhere else. That is not to say, at least if I understood Ali correctly, is that private, external, international, private resources is not important. I think it's an important part of the mix. But it cuts back to the fact that the resources, the most sustainable form of funding would have to come from home. And I think Pedro also made an important point, and he said reliance on ODA is no longer sustainable. And I think the 2 points are very linked. So I'll pick my presentation from there. To start with, I think at the heart of both the FFD outcome, the Addis Ababa outcome, and of course even the SDG and COP21 outcome, at the heart of it is the issue around domestic resource mobilization, the centrality of the state in all of this. Just to take you back to something that happened, and just because somebody raised at this point earlier in the last panel, there was this report last year by the African Union which says that the continent loses up to at least $50 billion a year through illicit financial flows. Now, essentially, if you break that down, you come down to about 500 modern hospitals. Now, I'm not talking of just simply clinics. I'm talking of real big hospitals. Now, multiply that by 15, you get 7,500 modern hospitals. Now, that can transform the quality of life on this continent. And that's the minimum. And so that is domestic resources that the continent, for example, is losing mostly to companies. In fact, the report says that the bulk of this is through the commercial sector, through transfer pricing and the like. And I just want to come back to the point that is very fundamental to the SDGs and, of course, to UNEA, and that is the environment. The bulk of this from the report also indicates that it comes from the extractive sector. And we know that the extractive sector, mining, the resources are finite, and they have such a huge impact on the environment. Having said that, I think globally, there's been a recognition of the fact that the global financial architecture is inadequate at best. It's weak, it's broken, and ought to be fixed. And I think it's on the basis of this that you had the G20 taxing the OECD with the base erosion and profit shifting project to develop an outcome to address some of these weaknesses. And so that at the global level, I think some progress has been made. But the point I want to make is that that is woefully inadequate. In fact, the BEPS outcome and package essentially still leaves a lot of holes for big multinational companies to continue to exploit developing countries, mineral-rich countries, to be able to shift their profits. And I think that we need to come back to a point which was made, I think, in the earlier panel, I think by Ali, about the fact that illicit financial flows flow out of countries that most need them. And if you look at it in terms of GDP, actually it affects developing or rich mineral resource countries the most. In fact, when the Swiss leaks, if you recall, came out, we did with our colleagues, just basically to look at it in terms of GDP. You'll be surprised, but that's the fact. I mean, a country like Sierra Leone lost just about $35 million, but in terms of its relationship to the country's GDP, it's huge. It's bigger than that of Germany. And yet, Sierra Leone has not been able to retrieve that. But we know that France, Germany, Argentina have made efforts to retrieve those resources. So coming back to my point, some of the global processes to address some of the weaknesses in the international financial architecture do not go far enough. They are piecemeal at best. And I think that the need for possibly a global body that includes all countries on an equal footing to address these systemic weaknesses. Because other than that, I'm afraid we will not be able to really rake in the resources that we need to be able to address the SDGs. And lastly, I just wanted to point out that going forward, quite frankly, we really need to move away from this paternalistic approach to development to a more partnership which includes both developing and developed countries, rich and poor countries, countries with natural resources but do not necessarily have the technology to extract them, to see how not just simply to extract those resources, but then also to add value to those resources in those economies. Because I think the point Ali was making is that you create the resources needed for the SDGs in the countries. That is primary, but that is not to say that private international resources are not important. I think I'll leave it there and then pick it up during the conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwesi. I think that the flow of the discussion among the 5 panelists has been terrific. Like Ali started by laying down the ground on the big issues that confront us in mobilizing resources, that it's not just an issue of where the money should come from, but also address the obstacles for countries to be able to mobilize resources within and also to tap resources globally. And we heard also from Pedro a very specific views coming from Brazil, a major developing country that has really played an active role in intergovernmental discussions on financing for development, also on the negotiations that led to the establishment of the technology facilitation mechanism. He also gave us an overview of what Brazil does domestically to be able to align resources towards the Sustainable Development Goals, very specific examples. And we heard from Noreen a perspective from business and industry on the framework that guides them in addressing this issue of mobilization of resources that actually goes beyond just finance. And of course, Ivo has guided us through a very specific area of engagement on mobilizing resources in red, and also gave us examples on how it can be done concretely through the green bonds example. And Kwesi rounded up the discussion by bringing us to where we began on the issues of systemic concerns that need to be addressed. He actually went on to recommend concretely to entertain the idea of establishing a global body to address these systemic concerns. I think the positive note that Kwesi ended up with, that we should leave the paternalistic approach of going around with a beggar's bowl is long gone, that the way forward is to really cooperate globally, and also to ensure that private, public sources of financing of resources will be mobilized towards the achievement of the goals, and more importantly, addressing systemic concerns such as illicit financial flows. So I would like to open the floor at this point for comments and questions from the participants that will stimulate the discussions with the panelists and among the panelists. We actually have 45 minutes. I think this is one of the few panels I've been where we have a lot of time, half of the time, for discussion. So I hope that you will not bungle it and be actively engaged in this. I'll try to provide some coherence and also system in the way we do this in the next 45 minutes. Can I have an initial show of hands on who wants to ask question? From this side, the lady in white. I'll go on this side first and then go that way. The lady in white, the other lady in that beautiful fuchsia pink. And anybody else? Okay, the gentleman on that side. Those are the first 3 questions that we'll entertain, and then we'll go this way. Yes, please. Please identify yourself, your name, and your organization, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Emily Rushton. I'm from New Zealand, from the Youth Stakeholders Group. I've got a question for Ivo. I'm really interested in the research that you've been doing around agriculture and that land use. What you said about needing to increase agriculture at the same time interested me, because I think as well we should not just be looking at increasing agriculture but changing the way we're doing agriculture, because reducing our reliance on animal agriculture would free up a lot of land use, it would free up a lot of resources, it would help redistribute food around the world, and keeping that in mind. And so I'd be really interested in actually more information around the research, because I'm sure you didn't have a lot of time to explain it all. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Alison Tate. I'm here with the Workers and Trade Unions Major Group. And our work, I wanted to add a little bit of the nuance of the discussion, because the investment and the private sector areas of work is often spoken of in very generalized terms. And I think we need to be much more nuanced about which actors we're really speaking about. So just to feed into that, for example, the very good work that UNEP has been doing around investment strategies, much more than Ivo has had a chance to speak about in this panel presentation, also needs to take into account the different institutional investors, it was mentioned. There are sovereign funds, there are pension funds, etc. And in the context of the work that we do with the trade unions in countries where unions sit on governance structures as trustees of pension funds. So there's some $25 trillion worth of capital sitting as workers' capital, as deferred wages, that make up, of course, the investments that come back to workers in terms of pension returns. But in that intervening period, then the use of that funding for genuine sustainable development investment is really important. And if we look at following the money, if you like, looking at where capital actually sits in the world, a lot of the liquid capital is sitting in pension funds work. So of that 25 trillion, which sounds like a huge number, doesn't it? But we know that we need so much investment in both social and physical infrastructure to really facilitate the kind of development we're speaking about, and the kind of low emissions investments and in production that we know is important. Of that 25 trillion, 17 trillion is actually under the control of joint trustees between business and trade unions. So I just really wanted to add to the discussion about how we can talk in much more detail about substantive investment strategies as a part of the work that we need to be involved in, and that already UNEP is involved with some of us as stakeholders in that process, but we need to make that much more visible so that in national planning processes and in the implementation plans at a national level for Agenda 2030, that we're really speaking about realities and not just ephemeral wish lists in the air. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. My name is Tim Andrew. I represent the Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association. So my interest is mainly on the marine side. And my question is to Noreen. You did show a list of the different represented within that council. So if you can just explain a little bit further on that. Thank you.
Okay, we will ask the panelists to address those questions and concerns. But first, I was reminded by Leticia that the session is supposed to close at 1. But since we started 30 minutes late, I actually assumed that everyone is willing to sacrifice 30 minutes of their lunchtime and the brown bag to extend this, well, to actually devote the 1.5 hours that we're supposed to be discussing this issue. But then we will try to optimize the time. I will ask Noreen to respond to this last question, the third question, and then I will go to other specific questions addressed to Ivo, and then we will go ask the opinion of the other panelists on the question on institutional investments and other institutional strategies to mobilize resources. And I'm sure Pedro from the Brazilian mission would have a lot to say on that, coming from the experience of Brazil, and also our friends from civil society, from Tax Justice Africa, and also from SDI. Yes, Noreen.
So thank you for the question, and it's pretty straightforward to answer. The first part of it is just to say that we do have, I think, abundant both oil and gas and fisheries industries represented, either under World Ocean Council or IPICA, as well as the broader, more inclusive business groups, International Chamber of Commerce, International Organization contact with them, and I'm happy to invite them. We're happy to have them on board. I mean, as many as we can cram on that slide, we'd love to have. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Excellent question. I mean, in general, in UNEP, we're of course advocating for a diet that is less based on the use of meat. The more meat we eat, the higher the demand on the available water resources, carbon, and land. At the same time, if you look at projections of demand for these types of agricultural commodities, they're only set to increase. Global population is set to increase, and as people become wealthier, the diet in general changes from less meat to more meat. So even while we're advocating for a diet that is less based on meat, we should also think about how can you manage land where there is a better alignment of increase output and value added of the agricultural sector with forest protection, for example. And one way to do it is to increase yield on existing land, provided that those inputs, provided that there is an agreement for less conversion of forest resources than otherwise would have happened. There's also a lot of degraded land around the world. So instead of using pristine forest through fiscal incentives, subsidies and taxes, including also trade or tariffs, governments can provide a stimulus to use degraded land as opposed to say existing forest land, and through those types of measures, we hope to make protection and sustainable use of forest a more attractive option by making it more compatible with the growth and the necessity to sustain employment and value added of the agricultural sector. Despite the fact that agriculture is responsible for 80% of deforestation globally, we need to make sure that reduces. Touching briefly on the second point, and I'll leave other panelists to do that as well. I mean, UNEP has, through our finance initiative, been working with investors to get an agreement from them to decarbonize $600 billion in investments, so basically away from fossil fuels and into renewables, and I fully agree. I just came back actually from London, where we had a big event with Standard & Poor's on the e-risk phase 2 report, and it basically shows that government debt is at risk if they fail to address environmental issues. As UNEP, of course, we want to avoid any rating downgrades and any increase in cost of capital, which would also have a negative impact on potential pension payouts, basically, to workers. So I think purely from an investment perspective, there's increasingly a need both to address the risk, but also to accelerate the transition to low carbon energy and economy, to work with pension funds, with asset managers and banks to accelerate that transition. So fully in agreement with that, and including the UN pension funds, I hope. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Pedro, in particular, what has been the experience of Brazil on institutional investments, and in particular, how do you align this to support sustainable development goals and also to increase ownership by the different stakeholders, not just the workers, as mentioned by the one person who asked?
Okay, thank you. Well, pensions funds in Brazil, they play an important role in many of the biggest companies. Some of them predominantly private, some of them of a mixed nature. And there are cases in which there are large asset holders. In other cases, they're sitting on the board pretty much. And in the case of the country's development bank, the BNDES, it relies to a large extent for its assets on unemployment funds. So how do you align these investments towards the sustainable development goals? In the case of the development bank, which is subordinated to the Ministry of Planning, it's easier, no, because the government is directly involved in the decisions that are taken by that bank. In the case of other companies of a private nature or a mixed nature, then it's really, I think, about integrating the 2030 agenda into the country's national development policies. It's pluriannual planning. We're starting to do this. Really integrated, to see it reflected in the national statistics as well, so that you can monitor it. And I think also what I mentioned before about the financial regulations, the banking regulations also can play an important part in directing those investments. Thanks.
Percy, would you like to have something on that topic on institutional investments?
Well, I mean, I think if you take the case of Africa, it's not that developed for a fact. In fact, some of the pension funds, you may say, are often being used by the governments to fund essentially debt, domestic debt. And so the kinds of institutional kind of funding from some of these seem to come from outside. And when they do come, often go to the extractive sector. And I did outlay some of the elements around and the concerns around the extractive sector. That is also linked to just this whole issue around hedge funds in some of the, key commodities exported by developing countries. And here I'm referring specifically to mineral-rich countries. Thanks.
Thank you for those answers. I'll get the second round of 3 questions. So far, we're doing okay. We'll probably be finished by 1:15 if we go this way. So I'll get, There's a lot in this bunch. 5. 6. Okay, Peter, Raul, our friend, is it Isis? No. The 2 ladies at the back, there and here. Please focus your questions. We'll try to group them together.
Thank you, Nath. Peter Denton. This time I will say I'm representing the United Church of Canada. And I wanted just to raise a couple of issues that I'd be interested to hear more conversation from the panel and also through the course of the next week. One of the issues, of course, is that business as usual is not possible looking at the 2030 agenda, that past and current economic practices have created an unsustainable world. So we need to have radical change, not incremental change, in order to meet the needs of the 2030 agenda. The second point is that the sustainable investment, the word investment, can too often be taken, particularly by business, quite naturally, to mean a return at some point. And I think that is precisely the problem. If we continue to look for a return on investment toward the 2030 agenda, we will undermine it. So there needs to be some other way of understanding a social investment, a planetary investment. We can still use the word if it makes people happy, but there has to be some other way of doing things, or we simply will be reshuffling the chairs on the Titanic as we await our last supper. The other issue looking at this is in terms of my organization, there needs to be a way of framing that point-to-point investment that gets outside the paternalistic investment strategies that have been identified as a problem or outside of ODA. There are lots of people who would like to find a way to help, but whether you want to call that investment or not, they want to find some way to help, and there are simply not the structures in place to enable that point-to-point, person-to-person, community-to-community engagement, as there could be if these were facilitated. A brief example, I met a young Maasai guy 3 years ago at Abaramara. He told me about his village that had no water. The women walked 7 kilometers a day. I went home to Manitoba. In 3 months, raised $10,000. The well was operational last April. They now have biosand filters in the village. This was facilitated by the Catholic Diocese of Ngong here, and who were quite happy to help out. But that kind of future, I think, is the way in which investment needs to be construed by all participants. Thank you.
I'm called Fongo Eric.
Me? Okay, thank you. This is Mohammed Abduraouf, Gulf Research Center. I represent the Science and Technology Measure Group. I have one question and one comment, just briefly. Of course, we face a lot of challenges, and the problems are complex, and the need for investment are very high. But we have also to think about simple solution with simple financing techniques. I think if we think about traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge, they can provide some very simple solution, sustainable and very cheap in various fields, especially irrigation, agriculture, and urban development. So, of course, this depends on case by case, from country to country, from city to city, from village to village. But also we have to take this into consideration. The second one is a presentation by Noreen, which I thank her for this, but you mentioned the governance, good governance, which is very key, I think, in various fields. But can you highlight different techniques or criteria for good governance, for, different policies, things like this? Thank you.
I'm called Fongo Eric from Cameroon. I represent ICNECDEF, the International Center for Environmental Education and Community Development. Yeah, we have talked on maybe finance for development, which is very critical and very, very important. I just wish to ask a question to Mr. Ali and Noreen Kennedy, that how is civil societies and the government of developing countries responsible of not raising the adequate fund to meet the SDGs? Because the fact that there will be limited maybe resources, it therefore means that it will be very difficult for them to meet the SDGs. So it is good that maybe some sort of a pressure should be placed on civil societies and the government so that they take the SDGs very, very serious, not just having meetings. Thank you.
My name is Juana Vera, and I come from the Gender Water Alliance, and together with the Women Major Group. My question is to the Mrs. Norine. Well, I could see in your presentation that still the business sector, it's very focused to see the environment only as a good or capital. But what about the environmental liability? Don't you think that if you include in your framework this environmental and social responsibility, it could be more a sort major group, business major group, sustainable major group? That is my question. And the second question, really, I like your presentation, Mr. Kwesi Obeng. Everybody knows here that to a large extent that the extractive sector are the most responsible of all the environmental degradation that we are now witnessing. So my question is, how many of those representatives of the extractive sector are sitting here or are involved in those stakeholder major groups? Otherwise, every year, UNEA only run the risk, yes, to talk and do some sort of lip service, because the major who is causing all these environmental disasters are not here, or maybe I'm wrong in my view.
My name is Lynette. I am an economics and statistics student at the University of Nairobi. My question would be that free market won't necessarily support sustainable development unless it is for profit, as we all know. So is sustainable development a responsibility of the government? And if it's not, then how are we making sustainability or sustainable investment lucrative for free market if it's not entirely on the government? So that's my question.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yugratna. I'm 20 years old from India, and I'm a second-year undergraduate student. I'm representing Plant for the Planet and UNEP Tunza here. My first question is to Mr. Wesi. You talked about creation of another global body to address resources for sustainable investment. How viable do you think is that this idea is? And how long do you think creation of such a body could take? Because we are discussing 2030, implementation of 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Do you think we can actually have a body by then and, I mean, not being a pessimist, but and also deliver results by that time? So I would really like to elaborate, you to elaborate on that idea because I liked it. And my second question is to Mr. Pedro Cardoso from Brazil. I wanted to ask about the Olympics in Rio, especially the inclusion of golf and the building of the golf courses in Rio. I have read and heard a lot about it, about what's happening in Rio because of the Olympic and the building of new golf courses, and golf has been introduced for the first time in 100 years of Olympic history. And because I live in India and I do not have access to the clear ground realities, as the international media coverage is also quite low on that. So I would really like you to elaborate on what exactly is happening there and how sustainable or unsustainable do you think that particular building of 14 chain of apartments or golf course in the city of Rio exactly is? Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much for the very awesome questions, no, from those 6 participants. Like, really awesome. And yes, and especially impressive, no, the 20-year-old lady who's with us here. I actually feel ancient listening to her, and I don't think I had half of that wisdom at that age. You inspire me. Yes, but I was before I proceed, no, I was reminded by Leticia that there's actually a brown bag event happening. It's sort of an orientation for newcomers. We definitely do not want to lose participants, and we will meet halfway. We'll try to finish in 15 minutes, eating up like 15 minutes of the time of the brown bag. So we can actually entertain all the questions. I will get the remaining questions from this block and ask each of the panelists to respond to either specific questions or to some of the provocative questions, especially, and to the general questions that need to be addressed on the issue of sustainable investment. So 3 here. You have the gentleman here, and then Wally and Rina. Rina is the last speaker. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I do understand the constraint of time. Like I said, my name is Ayo Olukoni. I represent an environment group, Fight Against Desert Encroachment, and we are involved on ground practically. Like I said earlier, it's been a long way from 1988 when the Brennan Report came and when we were discussing going to Rio. Then, for most of us in developing countries, we thought environment was a new conditionality. Thank goodness that is all over now. And I'm involved in practical initiatives on ground. We have a program in Nigeria because we thought we should not just stay at theoretical level. It's a program in connection with desertification. We have a village which we got involved with, and the people, this is yours, in terms of planting of trees and also water and wells. We had to get money to raise money on our own part, and also levy the people in the village because it is theirs. And that's one of the things I want Kwesi, my dear brother, to really address. How do we overcome this? Because part of the crisis is that when I was in government, I worked closely with the EU and others. Funds from the EU to get into environment programs, most of the times people are frustrated. Please go away with your environment programs. For the past 2 years, we are involved in it. It is not working. How do we get over that? The question of international financial architecture, we mentioned. All the way in the Havana Program of Action, we mentioned it. Monetary consensus, where are we? In our places, funding in respect of pension, forget it when it comes to the environment issues. The other one has to do with the fact with the extractive industry in there. I served in Australia as Nigerian ambassador with concurrent accreditation to New Zealand, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea. And I was part and parcel of the African Down Under Mining Conference every time. So where is the connection, AET, as far as funds from the environment? If you go to Perth for the African Down Under Mining Conference, the question of the environment issue, I'm not sure it is top on agenda. The final issue has to do with the question of environment and, of course, the issue of spiritual ecology, which the representative from Canada has mentioned that, look, they were able to raise funds from outside. In terms of that, How can we get the faith-based group outside? But like I said, at the end of the day, the issue is in our hands in our respective developing countries. And that is one of the things which I think we want to talk about. And like the African proverb says, very few people clear the path to the marketplace, but millions and millions of people work upon it. Hopefully, these MGS in this session will help to clear the path to the marketplace in terms of how do we get funds to be able to impact on Sustainable Development Program. We'll be able to discuss on other time because of time.
Thank you,
for the
Ambassador.
opportunity.
Wali and Rina.
Thank you. My name is Wali Haider from Roots for Equity based in Pakistan. It's good that I heard a lot from the podium about domestic resource mobilization while agreeing to that, all of that. Especially Kausi mentioned that reliance on ODA is not possible. We should not depend on outside money. Domestic resources are needed. I agree the need of the domestic mobilization of domestic resources. But don't you think, Kausi, that under the principle of CBDR, the developed countries are responsible for providing financial resources, those who needed that? And as my friend Ali Ahmed mentioned, from the podium, that very policies by the Western countries or wealthiest countries needed to decipher and to also look into. Whereas the policies of WTO, SEP policies of World Bank and other financial institutions are major hindrance of resource mobilization for country like least and developing countries. In that kind of dichotomy, how do you think that we can, the countries in the developing countries especially, able to get enough resources for SDGs, whereas there are agreed principle of CBDR. So I think we need also we need to stress of resources from those who have been historically responsible for this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Nat. So it's interesting to hear the panelists. I'm sorry, my name is Wadarina. I'm from the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. I'm part of the Women Major Group and the regional rep of Asia Pacific. So it's interesting to hear the panelists, especially on the needs of tackling systemic issues, including trade and investments on fair basis and also democratized global economy. On that, I want to add and I want to raise some major issues. We know that the Agenda 2030 gave a focus for the WTO, but give little attention to regulate the most recent generation of FTAs or mega trade agreements like TTPA, TTIP, and also RCEP, including the current negotiation on the Trade in Service Agreement. Yeah? We know that investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS clause in investment and trade agreement, many multinational corporations have sued government in closed-door tribunals for introducing or amending regulation and policies that reduce their profits. Even if state regulations are intended to secure economic and social rights and prevent environmental harm. In 2013 alone, there are 52 claims, and the majority of the cases was brought against developing countries, including the cases related to environmental destruction and conflict over natural resources. I really want to hear the comments from the panelists on this issue and how we can tackle this issue together. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a long list of concerns and questions, very interesting ones. I will ask the panelists to address not all questions, but the questions that they feel they should be speaking to, particularly coming from their background and their constituencies. But I'd like to flag up a few that needs to be really highlighted in your responses. I think that question on how to make sustainable investment just be beyond about returns, about that idea of bringing in social investments and also this spiritual ecology that the ambassador brought in, like how raised, how do you bring that into that discussion of sustainable investment? Also, the role of civil society and other stakeholders in mobilizing resources for SDGs, not just relying on government and private sector, like how do we bring in the active participation of civil society in this? Also, the concerns on extractive sectors and also on systemic issues. And there were very specific concerns and very provocative concerns as well, like this idea that was put forward by Kwesi on the establishment of a global body to address sustainable investments and to plug in the leaks and the systemic issues. And also, we have some very specific questions for Noreen on the conscience of business. Yes, and Noreen has been the conscience of business in this process. Like you asked the best person to answer that. And I'd like to reserve the last bit to Pedro for the most controversial question pertaining to the Rio Olympics, which everybody's awaiting in the midst of all these interesting developments happening in Brazil at this time. So I'll start with Ali and then go that way.
Thank you very much for those very, I think, interesting questions and comments that you've made. I think just in the interest of time, I'll just pick quickly a couple of them. I think one, the colleague from Cameroon, yes, I mean, I think it's always been said through the entire SDG process that this is not just a government responsibility. It is a responsibility for all of us, and we need to work together to implement it. But as far as the question of the raising of the resources that would be necessary for its implementation, yes, I think CSOs have a responsibility there to hold governments accountable, to seek for also innovative ways about how resources can be raised, to raise the flag where resources are not being appropriately utilized. So very often, I think what we have kept saying throughout the discussions on this panel is, much as it is important to seek also new sources of money and resources, and I would like to, point what Kwesi has raised before, that the fact that we are saying we need to raise domestically a lot more and utilize it more prudently doesn't mean we discount what would come from external things. The point I was actually trying to reemphasize is that we quite often jump on and focus on those resources that come from the outside before we even look at what we have at home. So, and that's where I think a civil society organization will have a big role. I'm happy to hear from the student of economics, and the realization that the market left on its own devices will not work sustainably. And that's why we say that we cannot expect that business just out of goodwill will do that which is necessary. I think this needs to be grounded in law, and where necessary, penalties to be imposed, because we just can't let business as usual to continue as it is. So for us to ensure that there is sustainable investments, that we have clean investments, it's not enough just to expect that business will do the right thing, but we must also ground it in appropriate laws. Again, this is where the state has to play its role effectively. I think I'll leave it at that and give the opportunity to my other colleagues to also respond. Thank you.
Okay, so just quickly on a whole host of questions. I think the first point to make, and I think it's pretty fundamental, unfortunately Peter has left, but this question of somehow having a mutually exclusive idea between either having return on investment or sustainability. I think that's a false dichotomy, and we've seen it here in UNEP, we've seen it, and we could give many examples of companies of whatever shape and size that are actually finding that if you do operate more sustainably, you actually do get a better return on investment. That's the whole, hopefully, inspiration of what UNEP is doing in its Green Economy Initiative and what so many companies and I think civil society is working on, that you don't have to pick one or the other. So that's one point. Second point, I did go very quickly in my presentation, and I'm sorry that I did not say more about what constitutes good governance. Again, I think Mohammed has left, but one point I want to make is that in the good governance bubble that is inclusive of corporate and social and environmental responsibility. There's only so much that can fit in there, and if I had more time, I would have gotten into that more, but that is definitively part of what we talk about when we say good governance as one of our 4 priorities or lenses as we approach, as business and industry approaches the SDGs. And, if you ask me what that means specifically, I mean, it starts fundamentally with obeying, law, a rule of law, and, works from there. We've already talked about bribery and corruption. We've already talked about codes of conduct and standards, and many things actually that, again, the UN Environment Program is working on. I mean, the question about the extractives industry, or at least the private sector part of the extractives industry. Again, UNEP has worked for a long time with the different extractives industry, sectoral groups in partnerships to try to actually bring their practices, towards improvement and to address some of these challenging issues. But I think that, they certainly will be here at UNEA too. And I think the reason why they're here at UNEA too is in fact to continue that trend towards reducing their impacts. So just to say that. And I guess I'll just close and say that, really from a business perspective, recognizing that there's sort of 2 things that come along with this term business as usual, which are a little misleading. First of all, business as usual is not a static situation. I mean, companies are competing with one another all the time, and so they have to keep changing, and they have to be dynamic to what consumers are asking of them and to policy regulations that governments are defining. And so one of the things that is very clear to us in the business community is that sustainability is here to stay, that it's not only environmental in nature, that it's including more and more social and human rights aspects. And, if we don't change to address and stay abreast of those very important considerations, we won't be in business. I mean, it's not even a question of license to operate, which is kind of the starting point, but we won't be able to compete. We won't have customers. So I think that that's what I'd like to end with, is that the notion here is really to create economic opportunity in a way that also advances sustainability. I myself have been very amazed and impressed by how much crowding in we've seen of business, and not just large business, but small and medium-sized companies as well. And I think there are many opportunities going forward to work with different important groups in civil society and local authorities to carry this forward. And the UN can't do everything. It can't all happen from the top down. A lot of it does have to occur at the local level, and quite a bit of it has to be instigated from civil society. So thanks very much, Net, for facilitating this great panel.
All right, thank you. I would try, and I think about 4 of them were directed to me, but if I do not respond directly to yours, please let's have a bilateral, possibly around the coffee area after here. But just quickly, a couple of things. There was this very direct question: how many of the extractive sector operators are here? I think that is a question we need to put to the UNEA. I think they are better placed to respond. But I suspect that Noreen, to an extent, represents, because I noticed she has ICMM as part of their team, so in a sense. But I think the question is an important one that probably should be put to the UNEA. Having said that, going back to the sister from University of Nairobi around sustainable development, I think really it is the role of the state. But unfortunately, we recognize that the current economic model, neoliberalism, has pushed the state away from its role. So basically to just simply regulate and deregulate. But I think that if you look at the countries that have made progress in the last 30 years, it's because the state played a particular role, not just simply as a facilitator, played a leading role, not to say that take business, but played such a central role, drove direct investments into areas that is so as important. And I think that for a region like Africa, we need to move towards that line. Other than that, we cannot make progress within the next 15 years. So that would be my reaction to your point. And back to my sister from India, yes, I think it's feasible. To start with, we do have the UN Tax Committee, and we do work with them. Part of the reason for which they've been inactive, in part, is because they've been staffed of the necessary resources. Compare that to the OECD, and the club of rich countries, which has enormous amount of resources. But actually, its kind of framework is essentially driving the interest of rich countries, as opposed to, So I think that it's doable and it's possible because the infrastructure already exists. And there's commitment in the UN Tax Committee. You have governments, you have private sector, you have CSO. Essentially, you have all the actors. And I think that if you have all the actors, you are more likely to get a buy-in quickly once agreements are kind of fleshed out. And so I think it's possible to have that done. The last thing goes to, response to my brother from Nigeria. Your question is very specific. How do we raise resources? I mean, I think a very quick response would be, for example, that Nigeria over the past 30 years has lost billions of dollars. Billions, both through what we know as corruption, but also through just blatant, aggressive tax practices by the major companies operating in the country. Now, I think if the country has been able to, say, plug those holes, it would have been possible to invest those resources, say, in national banks, as somebody, I think Pedro kind of referred to basically lend to communities like yours to be able to put in place certain things. But we know also that the current economic model will not allow the state to do that. So it's a very difficult thing, but I think that it's something the country, the state would have to do, would have to play a leading role, seal those loopholes, but of course it has to do that with the international partners, because sealing those tax global loopholes are not simply domestic issues. They are at a global level and they have to be done at that level. But the state can play a particular role which contributes to placing some resources available for groups like that, like yours, to be able to access and to put in place such basic infrastructure. So I think I'll end on that note, and we can have further conversations if you have a bit more time.
Kwesi,
Thank
you
you very much.
skipped one important question. How long will that take?
What?
How long will that take to put in place that body? Well, I was waiting for that response.
Well, I did respond. What I said was that the infrastructure already exists because we have the UN Tax Committee. It's functional, it's deprived of resources, so what it does need is the resources needed. Just last month, we had a meeting. There's a subcommittee on extractives, basically developing guiding principles for developing countries around the extractive. So what I'm trying to say is that the infrastructure already exists. It's not like you're going to start from scratch. And also because it's the UN, everybody has a reasonable say and input. And I think that could drive the process. And because SDG really is a global thing if you think about it. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to touch upon the issue of should we have indicators beyond financial ones, looking both at countries and at companies. So Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, has basically said that companies are basically being judged by their profit and loss statement, basically their annual income and costs, as well as their balance sheet, whereas countries only have an annual income statement, which is basically, say, the P&L of a country. They have no balance sheet whatsoever. One way to remedy that is, and perhaps this is something that the global major groups may want to consider, is to advocate for developing inclusive wealth accounts, which means that a country would not only be judged on their, say, financial capital, but also on the natural, social, and manufactured capital. And you can basically see, if you do that on, say, an annual or periodic basis, how wealthy a country is, and how, say, national income contributes to an acceleration or a depletion of all of these different types of capital. Then on company level, I'm a big advocate of pricing environmental risk in company valuations. If you look specifically at the issue of climate change, there's been the notion of we are not able to burn all the oil, coal, and gas reserves held by fossil fuel companies in the world if we are to stay within a 2-degree temperature limit. One of the other will break. It's either the climate or it's basically the P&L of these companies. As a matter of fact, some groups have said that 2/3 of proven oil, coal and gas reserves cannot be exercised. That is basically the flip coin of sustainable development. If that cannot be done, then one way or another, at some stage, this will be priced in the market valuations of both listed companies as well as private companies. And that by itself will also accelerate the transition towards renewable energy investments that the lady from Kenya basically mentioned. In many cases, solar and wind is already profitable. And if there's one thing that we see a trend is that renewables is getting cheaper in terms of cost per kilowatt hour, and fossil fuels are getting more expensive. And I think pricing environmental risk in the unsustainable practices is one way to accelerate that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for, I'll respond to the question about the Olympics. Thank you for the question. I'm now regretting very much not having read more thoroughly the information package I got at the embassy last week about preparations for the Olympics, and not having gotten to the part about specifically the golf fields. I'll be very happy to get your details to respond to that, to get back to you specifically on the issue of the golf fields afterwards. But what I can say is that the way that the Brazilian government has approached the whole issue of the Olympics is to try to create a legacy for the city, for the country, in terms of improving people's lives, creating an enabling environment for sustainable development, improving the environment, and using the Olympics to push forward many reforms that actually should have already happened. But it's a tool to use in that regard. So, for example, in terms of disenfranchised communities, many of the venues that are being created were designed so they can be disassembled afterwards to be turned into schools or sports facilities that disenfranchised communities from that area can use. And specifically in terms of the environment, there's been a lot of investment in public transportation and increasing the metro, expanding the metro system, putting together a bus rapid transit system, improving public transportation in general, improving sanitation, including with a view to cleaning up the Bay Area, where you're going to have many of the water competitions. So there has been this concern. I think that a lot of things are being done really in the right direction. Now, whether or not there will be a good legacy in that regard, we can't respond yet. I mean, we'll have to look at it with the benefit of hindsight later on, but we've definitely taken that into consideration, and we'll exchange cards after the meeting. Thanks.
Thank you very much for those wonderful answers. And to those who ask, if you're not satisfied with the quick answer that you got from the panelists in the podium, you're free to feel free to approach them after this. And I'd like to thank everyone for staying on, and I'd like to thank you even more for the very engaging way you have participated in this panel, and for the questions, the substantive, the quality questions that you've asked. I will not even attempt to summarize, but we will try to extract those that could actually be presented as highlights of the panel discussion, and probably even come up with some recommendations coming from this discussion that will be presented at the end of the forum tomorrow. So you will have your say whether we have managed to capture the essence of the discussions or not. So thank you for hanging on, and thank you for sacrificing 30 minutes of your lunch, and for skipping, to some of you, skipping the brown bag discussion. So thank you again, and have a good afternoon and a good lunch. Thanks.